here's the argument for trading away Dion Dawkins. 2025 was not his best year. The way I chart pressures, I had him allowing 40 pressures last year. That'd be 1 pressure for every 16 snaps. For PFF, his efficiency rating was mediocre. He was in the high 30s in terms of tackles in the NFL. So not even starter worthy when it comes to pressures allowed. Now, obviously, protecting the quarterback is only one part of being a tackle. But pass blocking has been Dawkins' strength most of his career, and I think it still probably is. And this year, that strength was not much of a strength. He was still good. He was still above average. But this, I think, by any measure, would have been a down year for Dion Dawkins. And I know there are some stats out there where Dawkins is top 10 in win rate or pass block rate or whatever it is. I will, as an aside, say that no matter what pass blocking, pass rushing stat you subscribe to, they're highly subjective. I can tell you all about mine. The way I chart them, if a defensive player impacts the quarterback, if they get a hit, if they move a quarterback off their spot, if they force a scramble, if they force a throw to be early or what appears to be uncomfortable and it's got to be obvious, then I call that a pressure. Some people will do it as the defensive lineman has to be within X amount of yards. I think it's 2 most of the time of the quarterback to qualify for a pressure. Everybody kind of does it a little bit differently. And they're all subjective to a degree. But I will tell you from my eye test and my pressure stats support it, this was not a good Dion Dawkins year by Dion Dawkins standards. Now, Dion Dawkins is going to be 32 in a month or so, a couple months in April. Offensive tackles can certainly play deep into their 30s. It's happened before. But it's reasonable at this point to be concerned that perhaps Dion Dawkins is hitting the backside of the old career. That this season is not just one bad year, that this might be the indication that Dion Dawkins is aging out of the league. And I know it's early to talk about it that way, but that's the point we're making. That the career has reached the apex and is now coming down the other side of the mountain. We don't know if that's true. We don't know if this year means that Dion Dawkins is not ever going to be the guy who went to the Pro Bowl 3 years in a row. It's very possible this might have been just one bad year. It's easily possible, too, that even if Dion Dawkins is on the backside of his career, that his decline will be slow and graceful and last 4 or 5 years, as opposed to being sharp and destructive. But if this year is an indication that the career trajectory of Dawkins is not something that's going to fit with a team that expects to go to multiple Super Bowls and win championships, it would behoove the Bills to move on from him now while you can still sell pretty high. Again, we talked about it on Thursday. This is the year too early versus year too late debate. There is no discussion about whether or not Dion Dawkins is currently a good offensive tackle. He is 100% that. And if the Bills traded him, I think it's pretty likely that there are 15 to 20 teams in the NFL who would get better this season having Dion Dawkins around. And probably a good chunk of them would get a lot better. But what Dion Dawkins did in 2025 was not as good as 24 and 23 and 22. And if the Bills wait around to be sure that a significant decline is happening, then it might be too late. If this season last year is an indication that Dion Dawkins is not going to continue to be a high-level offensive tackle, then I don't care where you think you are in the Super Bowl window, it makes sense to move on from that when you can still get a haul for it and A, be able to have assets to replace him, but B, and more importantly, make sure that you have a tackle that befits what your season is supposed to be when your team is ready. Because while a lot of this argument is going to be Dion Dawkins' trajectory in a vacuum, the other part of this I think we have to remember is that, like I said, the Bills with a first-year head coach and a first-year defensive coordinator and a defense that's going to go through a significant transition are probably not high on the list of teams that are likely to make a Super Bowl. That is not a formula for a team that's probably going to run their way to a championship. It certainly can happen. You got Josh Allen. He's your get out of jail free card for most problems. But it is asking a lot. So if we all get together and be honest about where the Bills are and understand that 2026, there's a good chance that ain't going to be the year. Well, now you're talking about Dion Dawkins at age 33 having to still be a left tackle that is commensurate with your Super Bowl expectations. And again, if his age 31 season that just happened in 2025 is an indication of a significant decline, then holding on to Dion Dawkins means when you roll into January 2027, when Joe Brady is firing on all cylinders as a head coach, when Jim Leonard knows exactly how he wants to operate his defense, when Jim Leonard has all his pieces in that fit what he wants to do, you might have a left tackle that can't hang, that can't protect your quarterback like you need him to. So if the Bills can be honest about where they are, I think it makes a good amount of sense to move on from Dion Dawkins early, get a guy in, whoever it's going to be, whether it's a veteran, a free agent, a draft pick, right now. And then when you get to the end of 2027 or 2028 or the extension of that window, you've got a left tackle that's playing at a high level, that's on the ascent, that is in his prime. And not a guy in Dion who at that point would be 33, 34 years old. And you're asking an offensive tackle to kind of hang on at the back end to make your championship plan work. Bill Belichick was always the kind of guy that said, let's move on a year too early instead of waiting a year too late. This is the discussion we're having with Dion Dawkins. And the thing is, the return for Dion Dawkins might be really good. Now, starting left tackles don't get traded a whole lot in the NFL. But there was one just last year when Houston sent Laramie Tunsil to Washington. Here's what the Texans got for Laramie Tunsil: a second, a third, a fourth, and a seventh. They also had to give up a fourth. All those draft picks weren't in the same year. 2 of them were in 2025 last year. 2 of them are going to be this year. But a 2, a 3, a 4, and a 7. And like I said, they gave up a 4. So really it's a 2, a 3, and a 7 for Laramie Tunsil. 2 day 2 picks and another lottery ticket for a left tackle who is only 4 months younger than Dion Dawkins. Now, obviously, when that trade happened, that was last year. So relative to the trade, Dion would be 1 year older. There's a lot of reason to think that if you're the Bills, you should be able to expect a second and third round pick for Dion Dawkins. That is not unreasonable. And maybe a little bit more, because Dion Dawkins doesn't have the whole Laramie Tunsil gas mask thing on his resume. It's a nice return. You do a lot of things with 2 extra day 2 picks, especially in a draft like this where it is flush with positions the Bills need. Can you imagine a draft where the estimate is, I think the number I'm seeing is 17 receivers in the top 100. I know that there's almost as many edge rushers who experts believe are in the top 100 of this draft. Can you imagine the Bills with 5 picks in the first 100 in a draft where there are 17 receivers and a whole bunch of edge guys? You could take your receiving group and your edge group and totally fix them in one offseason, in theory. That's what trading away Dion Dawkins would get you. In terms of the cap, now, getting rid of Dion Dawkins is going to be $26 million in dead money. And dead money is always, it's like the devil. I get it. No one wants to have it around. But in terms of what it does to the cap situation for the Bills, it's negligible. Depending on who you ask, Spot Track and Over the Cap, last I checked, were on opposite sides of this, but essentially it was a $2 million swing. Either $2 million that you would add to the Bills cap that would be bad, or $2 million or so of space that you'd create. It's when the cap is $300 million, that's couch cushion money. It's not swinging either way. Now, it's not ideal to have $26 million being allotted for a player who's not on your team anymore, which is what would happen if you traded away Dion Dawkins. But again, you move on for a player who might be on the decline. You set your team up to build for when your new coach and your new coaching staff is maybe more ready to be championship worthy. And you move on from that player at a point where they are still very valuable to where they would net you a whole bunch of draft capital. Laramie Tunsil got the Texans a second and a third and then some. The Bills could do a lot of things with an extra second and a third. So as much as I like all of that and think that's all worth discussing, there is one more piece of this puzzle. And that's obviously if you move on from Dion Dawkins, you got to find somebody to play left tackle. And that's where we get into a problem. Because the free agent market for left tackle this year is pretty awful, at least after you get past Rasheed Walker, the Packers left tackle, who's 26. And this is your classic rookie who is overperformed, who's ready to cash in big time, a guy who you probably could plug in at left tackle for 5 years and not even think about it ever again. A guy like that's got to get to the market. And very often when you have a position group that has one really good player, like offensive tackle, left tackle does in the NFL this year, that guy ain't getting it off his old team. That guy is not getting a franchise tag or some sort of offer that keeps him in Green Bay. Because then Green Bay would have the same problem the Bills would have if they traded away Dion Dawkins. If you don't have Rasheed Walker around, what are you doing? And I don't know what the Packers have, youthful or young guys beneath him or whatever. But in general, when you have a free agent situation where it's one great player and then a giant drop-off, that one great player isn't available. And then even if he is available, he's going to cost you a little bit to join the Bills. So we already talked about $26 million in dead money for Dion Dawkins if you moved on from him. Now, how much are you paying Rasheed Walker to get him in? Yeah, that first year cap hit might not be much, but it's still going to be $4, $5, $6, $7 million. So now you've committed $32, $33 million to play two players at left tackle, and that's optimistically, and that's when you already have your left guard and David Edwards and your center and Connor McGovern who are unsigned. You got to spend money on those guys too. Now, it's not impossible for the Bills to go about this. But even in the world where they were willing to spend on a guy like Rasheed Walker, you got to be able to attract him. You got to have maybe more money than everybody else does. Because again, this is the only guy that right now is available in free agency at left tackle. The draft is okay at left tackle. I think I counted 12 in the top 100. There's no Penei Sewell in this year's draft. And obviously the Bills wouldn't get to that guy anyway because they're picking at 26. So there's not a whole lot that the Bills could go out there and feel good about to say, all right, we're going to trade Dion Dawkins because we feel like he might be declining. We want to cash in on that investment. We want to sell high. We want to build our team for the window that might not really mature until after 2026. But even if the Bills want to do all that, there's just not a great option out there to say this is what you go with. Even on the roster, Tylen Grable's probably the best young offensive tackle the Bills have. Ryan Vandermark is a free agent. I think that's an option, but the Bills would have to bring him back and want to go with him at left tackle. He's kind of played both. I think Vandermark might have a better career as a long-term swing tackle in the NFL, the guy who can step in and play both spots in a pinch as opposed to being maybe really good at one. But there's not an option where you look at the Bills roster and say, boy, that guy's ready to step in. Not like Alec Anderson could probably play center or guard if the Bills lose David Edwards or Connor McGovern. I wouldn't say Alec Anderson is as good as either of those two players, but I don't think the leap from where he is now to being an adequate replacement is very big at all. You do have Cedric Van Pan-Granger at center. That's another option. So I think Granger's probably a little closer to being a starter than Grable is. Even the Bills have really indicated they like what Grable can do. I feel better about Granger if you wanted to say, we got to plug one guy or the other in and he's going to play 17 games next year. Granger to me might be slightly as a more dependable option. Either way, if you move on from Dion Dawkins, there just is not the off-ramp to another player that makes me feel good about selling all the rest of the stuff I just talked about. That even if you got a really good return for Dion Dawkins, and if you felt like he was a guy that you're not sure you can depend on to be an elite left tackle come January of 2028 at the end of next season, I don't think there's an option in there I feel better about right now that I'd say, go get this guy. Now, obviously, if the Bills are going to go out and get all these draft picks for Dion Dawkins, like I said, you go get a second and a third for Dion Dawkins. You can draft 2 receivers, you can draft 2 edge guys, and you can find a guy to be your starting left tackle. And maybe he's not as good as Dion, but if he's 80 to 90% of Dion by the end of 2027, and then you also have these receivers and these edge guys too, I would call that worth it. But that's still asking for a lot of things to go your way. We saw what the Bills did last year in defensive line. They spent 3 draft picks on D linemen, and only one of them really helped the team out last year. So just sitting here and saying you get all these draft picks and that makes sense, that'll make it all right, obviously is not the full or the end of the story. But I don't think it's crazy to discuss Dion Dawkins as a trade candidate because of the way he played last year and his age. And I think the fact that this team probably is not, at least it's not set up for 2026 to be its best year. One would think that after a year of experience and knowledge and transition on defense, that 2027 would be a more likely season, and then 28 and 29, everything after that, for this team to be really good then. And that's why moving on from Dion Dawkins now, why you can get a lot for him, and why you have time to plug somebody else in and let them mature into the left tackle you need when you're going to be a championship team in 27 and 28 and beyond, that's where it makes sense. I just don't see who that guy is. And that's the problem. There really isn't an easy answer to say, other than Rasheed Walker, who I think would make a lot of sense if you can sign him and if he even becomes available. But that's betting a lot on going to chase one free agent who every team that has any desire to improve at left tackle will be absolutely after. And the Bills, no matter what they do salary cap wise, and there's a lot of levers they can pull to create space, to give themselves flexibility, they're not going to be team A1 when it comes to salary cap space and overspending on a guy like Rasheed Walker. So while, again, I do think it makes some sense to think about Dion Dawkins as a guy you want to trade away, because there just isn't the adequate replacement, it's hard for me to really bang the table for that idea.
Get the Rochester First streaming app today for everything you love from News 8 On Demand, plus exclusive shows you won't see anywhere else. Search ROC and download for free on Roku, Amazon Fire, and Apple TV.